All right, and looks like we are live. So, hey everyone, I am back at it again. And today I've got a great discussion with you today. I've got Major General retired Dana Pittard for our discussion. It's going to be regarding the racial and social life regarding the military. Now, I just want to put out there as a disclaimer, these points that I share, and of course that Major General retired Pittard also shares, are just our points and our opinions, not the opinions of the Army as a whole. So I just want to put that out there as clarification. So I hope that you do enjoy today's discussion, and here we go with the intro. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Major General retired Dana Pittard. And how you doing, sir?
Hey, Otis, how you doing? Thank you for having me on, and thank you to everybody who's joined this cast. I look forward to having a great discussion.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, sir. I say first and foremost, just thank you for taking the time to come and talk with me today. I know we connected earlier today, and it's funny, we've got some connections, to say the least.
Yes, we do.
I know of your brother, and I know of your nieces, because my wife actually went to high school with your nieces here in San Antonio. So I thought it was kind of cool learning of that connection itself. But sir, I just wanted to, say thank you and just want to hear from you. A lot of folks are really tuning in today to just, of course, see this discussion that we're having with ourselves. An overdue discussion, I think that the Army as a whole is probably overdue in having for soldiers and civilians and family members of color. And so taking to talk to you today is something that is absolutely, I think, will be beneficial to many who are checking out our discussion.
Yeah, and the fact that your wife went to school with my nieces, it shows difference in age. I feel old now. But, no, the only I'd say if there was a ground rule at all, it's that there are no rules. Just be very frank and honest. I don't know how else to be like that. So if you're tuned in and you're afraid of hearing, the truth as I see it, don't get your feelings hurt. So let's start.
Well, yeah, the truth is always something that's absolutely needed. Sir, I'm part of a large African American Army officers group, and in that group, we have many mentors, many individuals who serve, a lot of years in the military, who, may not necessarily have traditionally had that opportunity to just hear from someone from, the general officers level as far as how race may played a role in your career. But before we even get into that, I'd like to at least have you just tell us, who are you? What's your background to the people that's checking out our discussion?
Okay. Originally from El Paso, Texas, so I'm a Texan, but also an Army brat. My father was in the Army. He enlisted in the Army in 1950. The Army had just been integrated by executive order 2 years before that, but was still having growing pains at that time. So he started out as a private, became a sergeant. He went to officer candidate school and eventually retired as lieutenant colonel. We were very, very proud of him in Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. And again, that's why I was raised in El Paso overall. I went to West Point. I graduated in 1981 and served 34 years. Yeah, served 34 years in the Army, and retired from the Army in October 2015. And ever since, I've been working at Allison Transmission. Our global headquarters is Indianapolis, so that's why I'm here. I've been working in this corporation for 5 years, vice president of defense programs. I'm married. My wife Lucille and I will hit 35 years in December. We have 2 sons, Taylor and Jordan. They're 26 and 24. My youngest son, Jordan, is in Texas, in the Houston area, and my oldest son, Taylor, is in Michigan. Neither one are in the military. They they're following their passions. And so, that's what I've always preached. That's what I love that they're doing. Enjoyed my time in the military. Mostly was in command positions. I was an armored cavalry officer or armor officer. During that span, I visited or been to 85 different countries around the world. I think my goal is 100 now. But enjoyed what I was doing. I was commanded from platoon through division, and my last significant job was as the JFLC-I commander, which is Joint Land Forces, whatever component in Iraq. So it's really starting the fight against ISIS in 2014. In fact, in a best-selling book, Hunting the Caliphate, which I urge everybody to get.
Yes.
It really is a good book told from two different perspectives. One from my perspective as commanding general and one from a special ops guy. But you also see that book, General Lloyd Austin, who was a CENTCOM commander. And I don't think he gets enough credit for some of the things he did during that fight and back and forth. But the book talks about the initial fight against ISIS. So I would love to talk to you about whatever as far as interest. And then, as far as racism, as I already said that just recently in the Foreign Policy magazine articles that experience racism at every level, from second lieutenant, really all the way through general officer, at different times. And different times you'll be challenged because there's obstacles that'll be thrown in your way. We know that, and you overcome those obstacles. My hope is that it's getting better than it was when I started out in the early 1980s. But the U.S. military, U.S. Army, is still merely a reflection of the society it serves. So
correct.
Racism is everywhere. Racism is in the corporate world where I am. There are 52 executives in my corporation. It's a global corporation, 52 executives. There's only one African American, and that's me. So it's even worse overall. And so wherever you go, you try to make a difference. The current corporation was 89% white when I started. We've now gotten down to 76%. That's not bad, and have really made more opportunities for people of color. But so I'd like to hear from everyone else as far as what your questions are.
Absolutely.
And let's get going.
So, sir, I've got a slew of questions that, of course, I'm going to ask of you. But, I encourage everyone who's checking out a discussion to send in your questions, send in your comments. We'll, of course, display it on the screen. And, of course, General Pittard will get a chance to answer them. And, be honest, be frank about it. Honestly, I had a thing that I put up on my personal Facebook page recently, and it's something that it kind of struck me again when I thought about it. I said, how are we supposed to live we've got the Army values of, loyalty, duty, respect, all those different things. We're supposed to have personal courage as one of our Army values, but a lot of us may not necessarily have the personal courage to speak on issues that affect us once we leave, our regular workplace. I'm talking about issues of racism. I'm talking about issues of prejudicial bias that people may experience. How is one supposed to live the Army values if they're having, certain stripes dealing with racism in their workplace, especially if they're in the military?
Sure. I always believed in calling it out where you saw it as much as possible. And or performance, I guess, almost trumps everything. But I had the confidence to do that. So if it was blatant, I would say something. But I understand. In the civilian sector as well as government or the military, that can be very, very difficult. At least the Army and the military has avenues as far as EO complaints, things like that. There's officially, but I always called it out wherever I saw it. And if those of you who read the foreign policy article, it's not easy. It wasn't easy when as an African-American captain in the 11th ACR in this squadron. I was the only African American officer. There was one other, his lieutenant, but he'd left by this time. And in fact, there were two of us. Let me get that. There were two of us. But on a social event, this is in Bad Kisken, Germany, coming back from Fulda after I don't know, some kind of dining out, whatever, with our wives on the bus and everything else. Somebody said when the lights of the bus came out, hey Dana, can you smile for us? And it was absolutely insulting. I was seething, but didn't say anything until the bus stopped. Then I took this major, and again, I'm a captain, but I took this major aside and said, what are you talking about? You're saying this to me? Saying this in front of my family and everybody else? There had been giggles on the bus too. So I talked to the squadron commander. Nothing was done. So I filed a formal complaint. They got up to reservoir commander. The major was removed. But you do that at risk. Because I knew that there was people out there who now would be kind of gunning for me, whatever. So I just had to outperform. So performance trumps all. It's competence, compassion, and courage. Your competence will trump everything. So you just got to be good when you do it. Even as a battalion commander, when I called out my brigade commander for that painting on his wall of Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general, who and again, I know my history. I majored in military history at West Point. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, who eventually became a Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon after the war, and even when he was the general, when Black Union soldiers surrendered, he had him executed. He should have been hung after the war. But here's this painting, Don Stiver's painting, that was very popular back then, of Nathan Bedford Forrest. So I called him out, I asked him about it, took him aside, talked to him, and he was enraged. So he was going to do all he could to make sure that I didn't progress. But
wow,
I had one of the best battalions in the brigade, so can you do that? But again, you got to back it up with your competence too. But you should not in your area. You should not in your area allow it to stand, because if you don't take a stand, then it'll continue. So I always believe in that. And the old Army thing of you see a correction, you own it. If you pass it by, same thing when it comes to ending this legacy of systemic racism. We all play a part.
Systemic, and I would say subtle racism, even the slights that go on that people look over. People tend to not want to. I don't want to stir the pot. I don't want to say something at risk of being outcasted by my coworkers who may be majority white. How is, I could talk about myself personally, but I know of many soldiers out there who are fearful of, this may be a career ender if I end up speaking out about this soldier that's doing this, or this stupid joke that's said here, or this moment that's said here. How is one supposed to believe that the EO program is supposed to actually work for them? People may have bad situations.
If it's really blatant, but at the same time, I guess I would also counsel, pick your battles. I was a general officer in a war zone. This was 2007, and I was in Fallujah for the change of responsibility of two different Marine units. And there was a 3-star general there. And after the ceremony, people are in little clusters talking. So there's 3 different clusters of general officers. I was with 1-stars. There was this 3-star general, quite animated, telling a story to these Marine officers. And he was saying, he was talking about an Iraqi insurgent. He said, that Iraqi insurgent was so scared. He was like a coon in a Klan meeting. I was in the next group over, and I said, what? And so I walked over, and he and I exchanged looks at that point. And I was walking over to say something, and then another Marine 1-star, it was a Brigadier General Propotable at the time, stopped me and said, he didn't know what he was doing. He's he's single. He doesn't have a filter. He's real not prejudiced. Dana, he didn't mean it. Now that 1-star who stopped me ended up being the future commandant of the Marine Corps. General Bob Nellis.
Yeah.
The 3-star, I'll say it, it was General James Mattis.
Wow.
And it was a shame.
Wow.
And then my aide came up and said, "Sir, the helicopter's ready." So I just left. But,
Yeah.
we just stared each other down. And then I got on my helicopter. Now, one would say, should I have gone back and said something, or should I have brought it up during his Senate confirmation of me Secretary of Defense?
Mm-hmm.
I still thought that as a Marine officer, beyond his racial leanings, that he was competent. You pick your battles.
Pick your battles. Pick your battles to say. Well, sir, of course, as I spoke earlier to you before, I'm going to have questions and comments coming in. So I've got 2 questions that already came in.
All right.
And I'll allow you to, let's hear your point of views on these questions. So the first question comes up from, I believe this is a personal group. And so I'll read it off to you. It says, what are your thoughts on removing photos, names, and racial identity from promotion boards? What are your thoughts on doing so? Do you think we need to see an increase in Black officer promotions?
Oh, yeah. Obviously, I think we do. We do need to see an increase overall. And I like the idea of removing photos, names, and racial identity from promotion boards. However, that only gets to some of the problem. There's an implicit bias period. Again, I'm going on my own experience, but my first 2 OERs as lieutenant, you just wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt. The battalion commander didn't know me very well, but got 3 block. I didn't really understand. I thought, oh, this is pretty good. I had no idea. It was 2-3 blocks in a row. It wasn't until later on was the S1, and I noticed other new lieutenants coming in. One lieutenant, his father, this was an armor battalion. His father was a 2-star armor general. He got a 1 block immediately. He is not even half as good as I am. There's still implicit bias with OERs, I suspect. Now, that's just an example. It was years ago, but I suspect we still have that issue. So there's got to be some accountability. What I'd like to see is some accountability with senior raters as far as their racial profile for senior raters. How do you rate the people of color, male, female, the array of officers and or non-commissioned officers, because it includes the same thing for NCOERs. So hold senior raters accountable. So I'm okay with removing photos, names, and racial identity, and you just see the OERs and ORBs. OERs, officer efficiency reports, for those who don't know, and ORBs, officer record briefs, which shows what your assignments are. But at the same time, we got to hold senior raters accountable that may have a negative racial leaning.
How do you hold them accountable? What would you recommend to, say, a senior leader that's checking out our discussion? How do you hold them accountable?
What I would recommend, and it just so happens out of the blue last Saturday, an old friend and colleague called. I thought it was going to be a 5-minute, 10-minute call, but it was an hour call. And it was my classmate from West Point, General Jimmy McConville, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army. And we were talking about ways of dealing with this legacy of systemic racism. His heart's in the right place, but we still got to take some action. So what my recommendation there with senior rater profiles is, right now, senior rater profiles are watched as far as making sure that whatever it is, it's no more than 50% in a 1 block, or it may have changed on how that is done. But you also should have a profile that is watched by HR, whatever it's called now, PERSCOM, HR command, on a senior rater's racial profile, as far as how he or she rates people of color. Because it'll be real obvious real quick, I think, for those who are not doing a good job of that have this implicit bias against maybe people of color. And now once that starts, now people will be much more cognizant of it. It's like, well, I got to get at least a couple of them up there. Oh, okay, that's good. It's forcing something that should be natural. But yeah, if you, again, like the question, if you cover up the photos, you cover up the racial identity, that's one piece of it. But that doesn't take care of the implicit bias that is within units. That battalion commander, good old boy, and taking care of folks, as opposed to really looking at the performers. That would be my recommendation. Curious what other people think. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? And maybe you can provide folks an example of both. You said the word implicit bias multiple times. Can you give us examples of what implicit bias could be in the military and explicit bias?
Yeah. Implicit bias is so much more subtle. Implicit bias can be, how you've rated people of color within your unit. I mean, and you're not called accountability because nobody really sees that. There's no mechanism right now to see that. Another implicit bias is assignments and branches, and what some of our cadets, whether ROTC, West Point, OCS, are told. Many of them are getting advice. Well, get a technical skill, go signal, go logistics, which we need quality folks there. But there is this preponderance, at least when I was in, again, my information is at least 5 years dated, preponderance of minority officers are not in the combat arms.
Yeah.
So we've got to do a better job of nurturing that. We need quality leaders all throughout the Army. But if we're going to have a shot at somebody becoming, say, the chief of staff of the Army or leading this Army, they're going to have to be combat arms. So we need to do, I think, a better job of balancing that out. At one time, it was thought in the Army to do the detailing. That was disastrous because you had, in fact, there were twin brothers, and maybe one of them's listening right now. One, and I think they went to someplace in Virginia, maybe Virginia State, I'm not sure. But and they're both African American. One, they both wanted to go logistics, I think, quartermaster of transportation. One went that, but the other one was detailed, I think, infantry. He didn't want to do it. And so if you really don't want to do it, you're probably not going to do it very well. So it did not, in fact, that was just an example of that being disastrous. But implicit bias with assignments too. Is there a bias in what commands one might get as a captain? Is an implicit bias on where you're assigned? What units? Is there implicit assignments or implicit bias with who then at the major level gets the S3 job or XO job?
Got it.
So that's where the more subtle things occur. Another example of a certain, say, kind of bias that was told to me by someone. There are, I don't know, is it 26 or so, maybe battalion level commanders at Fort Carson, as an example. There may be more, so someone on there can correct me. A 4-star general called down to division commander there at Fort Carson not too long ago and said, hey, I want to kind of know how Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so's doing. And it just so happened that Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so, his father was a retired 4-star general. And he wanted to know what they were, he had just taken command of a battalion. What's the pathway you're looking at? Is he going to be your G3? So when you have something like that, yay for that guy. He's got a 4-star who had been mentored by this guy's father, calling down now about his son. That's great. But most of us, especially people of color, we don't have that. Someone looking over your shoulder and saying, hey, what's next for you? And it may be the lack of mentorship, but just that bias. I would say that the Army needs to move to where you're not allowed to do that, where a senior leader is not allowed to influence that make that a requirement. You can't do something like that, but it happens all the time. And oftentimes young officers of color and mid-grade officers of color lose out. So that's kind of implicit bias. Now, the more obvious bias you can deal with because you see that, and then you can call it out. But it's the implicit bias that sometimes happens.
It almost seems the implicit bias is more dangerous. It's the subtle bias that sweetens your racism tea, you could say.
Well, right. I mean, you may wonder, wait, how come so how come they're slated to go here to this
Hmm.
assignment? Well, I got people looking out for them, and a lot of people of color, as well as even female colleagues who are officers and senior NCOs, don't often get that. Um, I
Yeah.
hope it's changing, but that's what I've seen.
The benefit of the doubt is something that, I would say people of color, we're not asking to be treated differently or better than or
Mm.
anything like that. Just give us a fair chance. Give the benefit of the doubt that everyone who is unfortunately not a minority oftentimes get, is what I'm kind of getting the gist of your conversation, sir.
Yes, in fact, even if there's, inevitably there may be an issue where someone is in trouble. Well, how do you deal with that? Well,
Yeah.
oftentimes it's okay, okay, Bob, you just got to do better next time. That may be the
Hmm.
majority officer, but for a person of color, it's like, whoa, we're going to make an example of him
Yes,
or her.
yes, yes.
So it's like you're not given the benefit of the doubt sometimes, and if something does go wrong, it's like you already had a strike against you. So like
Correct,
that's it. So we
correct.
got to watch that at all levels.
I got you. So we got way more comments and
Okay, keep going.
questions coming in. So let's go ahead and drop another question from someone named Benny. Said, do you believe it should be mandatory for schools to teach correct history, to include Black history, segregation, etc.? Would this assist in combating racism? Sir, if I could add a quick word on this. I lived in Germany for the past 3 years. I came back last year after living there. And my family and I had the chance to actually travel around to different museums that they had regarding the Holocaust and, the history of Germany that, oftentimes I would say in the American society, we don't really have anything that details in graphic details the evils of our past. We don't really have that. Germany had that. Germany also has a culture of not shying away from what occurred in the past and allow the teaching of our current kids and adults, etc., to know what occurred. So I'm going to say that's what Germany does. But what do you say in regards to the question that we have here?
Oh no, I've always been a big proponent of tell the right history, the history
Yeah,
as it is, good, bad, the ugly. And difference in Germany, though, it's more centralized as far as how that's done. In America, as you know, individual school districts can decide, even
correct.
states.
Hmm.
So it is not necessarily a fully accurate view of the genocide of Native Americans,
Hmm.
whether it was through force or through disease brought by Europeans
Hmm.
and some Africans, obviously, to the New World,
Hmm.
decimated the population of Native Americans. The slavery for years, for centuries that was taking place. No, we've got to tell that. We've got to tell about Tulsa, what
Hmm.
happened there, the riots, and then how many of our fellow African Americans were killed. Honest discussion on lynching and how
Hmm.
prevalent lynching was. And in school, Reconstruction is taught a little bit about Jim Crow, but in fact, it
Yeah,
was really a systemic way of terrorizing the African American populations, primarily in the South, but there's states in the North that had it too. I'm in
correct.
Indiana. Southern Indiana had lynchings. It's amazing if you ever go to and we're trying to do better. If you go to the museum I don't know the name, the Museum on Lynching. I think it's Lynching and Injustice in Alabama. It
Hmm.
is eye-opening. Um, the the fact there's a National African American Museum in Washington D.C. That's
Yes.
good. I mean, that's a start, but we have to get it into our history books. No, I think that's good. In fact, when I was at Fort Monroe, serving as the deputy commanding or deputy chief of staff for operations, so it was the G3 of TRADOC. I would run in the morning, and the first time I noticed this was this historical marker, and it was just very plain, right next to the water, and it said, at this point in 1619, Captain whatever, so and so, and 20 to 21 African slaves here. That was where slavery in America began for Africans, future African Americans. I just thought, my goodness, this is right here. So I was glad to see that more of a big thing was made of that, the 400-year history in 2019. When I run by there, that was like 2009, 2010. But the bottom line is, yes, I do think it should be mandatory, because we will not understand this. How do you get along with others who don't look like you? I mean, we got to do better with Latino history. It's more than just the Mexican-American War, and we took California and Texas, and I mean, there's so much more to this fabric that's been woven together called America, which is a wonderful country, but we got to celebrate our diversity and inclusion.
Correct. I got you, sir. We got more questions. I'll go ahead and just put them up. We've got another question coming in from Miss Angel Jackson. She said, if you were asked which steps in the Army to take right now to affect change, Black soldiers, what would it be?
I think things like the 360 degrees evaluations are a start. I think what I mentioned already, for whether it's senior raters for NCOERs or senior raters for OERs, that they must have a profile for the people they rate from a minority standpoint. That's the thing I would change. The idea of this listening campaign, and when's the last time and that's what I asked General McConville, when's the last time at your dinner table you had somebody of color? He said, oh, what you talking? I said, seriously, Jimmy, I mean, for dinner. I'm not talking about, you happen to go by a mess hall or dining facility. For dinner, I had a real conversation with like someone that's not like you. Yes.
Your actual home, your actual comfortable place.
Absolutely. Encouraging that kind of dialogue. Also, in looking at people who are natural mentors, who have like general officers in their aide-de-camps. How many of them are people of color? Some general officers made it a point. I know at least 50% of my aide-de-camps were minority officers. And some do that, but some others, absolutely not. So it's like encouraging that to an extent. There are other steps, even the symbolic step of renaming those 10 installations in the Army are named after Confederate generals who betrayed our country. It's like, why? I always wondered that. That would be more symbolic. And then I would ask others like Angel Jackson and others who are saying that, from your perspective, what do you think needs to be done? Because the Army right now is trying to listen. At least they say they are. Yeah. So they may not want to hear it, but now's the time to hear it.
Now, I would say the Army is, thank you, Angel, for your question. I would say the Army is trying to hear it. Just a quick reveal, I've got some other important folks in our military right now that's going to have our live discussion just like this. So, of course, if you're a senior leader, or even if you're a junior leader and you want to have that open dialogue that's obviously encouraged right now in the military, come on by and I will have you as the next person to come and talk with us. So good answer, and I really appreciate that answer, sir. We've got, of course, more questions. Well, go ahead.
I can say one more thing. And the Army leadership is trying to listen now. So I know that there's an interest from Sergeant Major of the Army Grinston to maybe talk to this audience. And I'll tell you that if invited, I would not be surprised if the Army Chief of Staff, General Jimmy McConville, would also do it, because they're really trying to reach out.
Well, sir, I'm going to say, since you did say that he is your classmate, go ahead and put a little plug in there. Hey, sir, here's an opportunity. You could come and talk with this young man who wants to talk with you. But I'm going to go ahead and share some more comments and questions here. So I've got a comment here from someone, and it said, this is Mr. R.J. Spikes Jr. I said, I met Major General retired Pittard in UAE in 2013 while deployed. I approached him after an evening swim and gave him an awkward greeting as he walks in a boot. The next day, I gave him a brief on the operations. He gave me a huge hug and handshake. You should have seen the look I received from a battalion commander. LOL, priceless. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to speak on this topic. It's very much needed. Hey, no problem. And, I'm going to say definitely thank you too, sir. Obviously, you've left a legacy on folks that remember those impacting moments with you, of course.
Well, I appreciate him approaching me after the pool. As as you become more senior, you have got to make it a point to talk to folks because you become so more isolated, and there's
Correct.
all sorts of filters between you and soldiers, junior officers, NCOs. So I appreciated him doing that,
Awesome.
and just letting somebody know that they're not alone is kind of cool.
Awesome. And of course, we've got a question here from Mr. Dewan Lee. He said, "I don't want to take away from your words, sir, but it's but something heavy is coming after that but word." But he said, "But it sometimes appears as if the only way to fight racism within the ranks is by being a better performer. Isn't this less helpful to those soldiers who are considered average?"
Yeah, and I understand that. I was giving that as an example because that's why I felt like I could take risks because I felt like I was talented enough. I don't want to have a big head or whatever, but I felt like I was talented enough to where, okay, you don't want me, I can go to the civilian world and do just fine. You got to have confidence in yourself, and you got to. It's also drive. I guess. What I learned from my parents, my dad went to Virginia State and my mother went to Howard. And my grandparents worked 4, maybe 5 jobs just to put my mother through school. Was this idea and this work ethic of to be the best you can. You have to work, almost double as hard, put double the time in. And so that's how I looked at it, good or bad. It shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way.
I was thinking about that, sir.
It shouldn't be that way, but that's how I was raised.
The question is, why should I have to work doubly hard simply because of the color of my skin? Why should anyone have to go through that? It seems absolutely unfair. It's like almost mental terrorism that you got to go through.
Yeah. So sorry about that. But that's how I felt. And that's why, you're in San Antonio. My brother's an attorney there in San Antonio. He worked hard to be that. We all have in our family work ethic that came from rural southern roots of farmers who took that to the north and just worked their butts off. So that's one way my family has fought racism, is just be better. So getting back to the point about average performer, okay, average performer, you'll get average results. And so maybe someone who is only performing average maybe has an issue with raising the alarm, but that's still no reason to allow racism to pass. You just can't. You got to call out wherever you are, wherever you really see it, and you can certainly document it, whatever. So I don't know if that answers the question, Dewan, but I would encourage anybody who says they're average to work harder.
Got it. We got another question coming in from Mr. Spikes again. Said, sir, what are your thoughts on the response of the obvious racism in our country and from Army leaders, senior leaders, compared to other services? Interesting.
Okay, I'm missing that. Say that again.
So let me read it again. It says, sir, what are your thoughts on the response to the obvious racism in our country and from Army senior leaders compared to other services? I think they're trying to say, what are your response regarding racism in our country and comparing, racism that goes on from other services and then from Army leaders itself?
Well, bottom line is we have to end this legacy of systemic racism because it has manifested itself in how our society values people of color, specifically African Americans. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. It's and I hear people say, well, all lives matter. It's like, you don't get it. because it is so pervasive in our society that in our police departments, and people are focusing on police now. Oh yeah, police, we got to clean them up. It's like, got it. But it's the entire society. It's bigger than the police.
Yeah.
It is absolutely bigger than the police. It is how we value as a society, really African Americans. And I'll say people of color in general, but African Americans specifically, because of this legacy of slavery, but this legacy of systemic racism.
Yeah.
So our country is still a racist country in many ways. There's things we can do from a social, for social and economic viability within our own community, Black community, African American community. But there's one thing we cannot do alone, and that's in this legacy of systemic racism. We need white people to do that. The oppressed can't really do, the oppressors got to do that to the extent. And there's folks who'll say, I never owned any slaves. None of my relatives owned slaves. It's like, got it. Original sin, got it. Just, we repent, but now what are you doing about it? How are you making a difference? And so to get to the other part of the question, which had to do with different services have different legacies. The Navy, I think, has had its issues in the past. I thought the worst of all when it came to racism, I really thought was the Marine Corps. Marine Corps to this day has not had a 4-star Black general, as an example. And that's just the officer side, but the Marines were always slow on that. They're trying hard, but it's always been kind of slow on that. Navy was next. Then the Air Force and Army, I thought, were a little bit more enlightened from that perspective. Now, some of you out there, airmen and soldiers, say, "Oh no," but compared to the other services, the Air Force had, he used to be the NORAD commander, and I cannot think of his name offhand, but I think he was the first 4-star Black general of any service, and it was the Air Force. Chappie James, General Chappie James, I believe. The next was the first African-American 4-star was General Robinson, who I think Fort Bragg should be renamed Fort Robinson, as he was an African-American commander of the 82nd Airborne, way back when people didn't like us. They still not, they really didn't like us then. So that's how I compare the services. The Army has made some strides. Again, I don't want to be so focused on general officers, but I'll mention a statistic. There's between 43 and 46, just by my own count, of current active duty African-American general officers in the U.S. Army. That's not bad. If you look at out of 300, you guys can do the math probably much better than I can on that. But if we're 12 to 13% of the population of America, it's much higher. And you compare that to the CEOs in the Fortune 500 in America, and we find the civilian sector wanting. So there have been some strides that have been made. The U.S. military was first to integrate of any major entity in our country. That was 8 years before Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1956, the Supreme Court judgment. So some strides have been made, but it just hasn't gone far enough.
Got it. Sir, let's pivot a little bit. Sponsorship and mentors. Obviously, sponsorship and mentors is something that's, absolutely needed, I believe, if you were going to go through your military and heck, even your civilian career. Can you talk a little bit about sponsors and mentors that you've had in your time that allowed you to flourish?
Sure. I don't know if anybody saw what Lieutenant General retired Stanley wrote. And he was a Marine general. And it was very enlightening. Of course, I think most people have seen what General C.Q. Brown said, that he was thinking. I'm thinking about. I know C.Q. Brown. I like him. Most of us had white mentors for the most part, mentors who were white. My first African-American mentor wasn't, in fact, I was a captain in the 11th ACR, and there was a major at our regimental headquarters who was a signal officer, but he took me under his arm, Wally Parham, and I'll never forget that. Unfortunately, he later was killed in a motorcycle accident. but he got all of us together, even though we were spread out through the Love the ACR footprint in Germany for social events, but would talk to us about how things were. I'll always appreciate that. And they wasn't even in my branch. I was armor, he was signal. Yeah, I seek out mentors, and people who have sought me out. That's a phone call. Have sought me out in the past. It's a two-way street. Seek out people and let people know you're there. But don't be afraid that if your mentor doesn't look like you, because it's all about you learning as much as you can and having somebody kind of guide you and teach you a little bit. General Kip Ward, who really doesn't get enough credit for the things he did. When I was a cadet at West Point, he took me under his arm when he was Captain Ward, and never forgot that. Coming through the ranks, he would always look in on me. I always appreciate that. So I'd ask the people who are looking for mentors to make sure that you're a mentor. That once you get 2 years of experience, now you can mentor somebody. And maybe you weren't mentored, but reach out and touch someone.
Got it. We've got another question, sir. Comes in from Mr. Spence. He said, sir, can we have a re-education on these icons after whom the bases were named before renaming them?
Oh, you mean on, I just want to make sure I understand. You mean, so a Fort Hood, you want to know about John B. Hood, the Confederate general? Or do you?
I'm gonna assume, so let me reread what he's saying. He said, sir, can we have a re-education on these icons after whom the bases were named before renaming them? I think what he's trying to do is make people aware of just how slanderous or how bad these individuals actually were before we actually go through the process of renaming them after. Maybe if people are aware now of just how not good these individuals are, there won't be that much of a sting when going through the process of renaming them.
Sure. I mean, I can give a very, very quick one on that one. In fact, the bases were created and named two different really periods of time. One was right as the U.S. was entering World War I in 1917. And then the other was preparing for World War II in 1940. I know, obviously, Pearl Harbor was 1941, but we started really kind of getting these camps and forts ready then. So let's just take a couple. I mean, Fort Hood was named after Confederate General John B. Hood, who was from Texas, but as a battalion level commander in the Confederacy and even brigade, he was pretty good. But it's that Peter principle. Once he raised to Army level, he just kept getting his butt whooped and losing limbs. He lost a leg, he lost an arm. It's like that Monty Python, skit. But I mean, he just got pushed out by General Sherman in Georgia. He was the last thing between Sherman and Atlanta, and his army just deteriorated. He was destroyed. So John B. Hood wasn't that great. Fort Bragg, named after General Braxton Bragg. I mean, his big battle was Chickamauga, and did pretty good. Defeated the Union, but didn't pursue them. And after that, he did really nothing else. He was known for one word that keeps being seen throughout his life, and it's called irascibility. He could not get along with anybody, any of his peers, even when he was at West Point. He was a terrible general. In fact, ended up resigning from the Confederacy before the war even ended. So he was terrible. You had Fort Benning, and General Benning was from Georgia, but of no note. Nothing really about him significant in the war, Civil War. So don't even know why it was picked after him. There's Fort Pickett. named after George Pickett, who was Pickett's Charge in Gettysburg. That was disastrous. It was terrible. I believe it was Pickett that then went to Canada after the war because he thought he would be tried because he had executed Union prisoners. Terrible. There's Fort A.P. Hill, named after Ambrose Powell Hill, who was one of the Corps commanders under Lee. Didn't do very well. There's two posts that are named at Fort Lee and Fort Jackson. Robert E. Lee, very good tactician, did well, but still betrayed his country.
Correct.
So it's not necessarily based on the fact that they did well or didn't do well. Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, known as Stonewall Jackson, was very good on the battlefield, and we should study some of these folks because of their performance on the battlefield. But we should not venerate them. We should not glorify them because they betrayed the United States. They committed treason. That it was very nice that we did the Kumbaya after the war, but most civil wars throughout the world, when you betray your country, you are tried and you are executed, or at least imprisoned. And only a few people were in prison. I mean, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was, and then the commandant of the terrible prisoner of war camp, Andersonville, ended up being tried and executed. But everybody else was kind of pardoned. And I think that was a mistake, but I wasn't there then. I trust Abraham Lincoln's judgment, but he didn't get to see it through because obviously he was killed 5 days after Appomattox on April 14th, 1865. So I don't mean to spout too much history here, but most of the Confederate names, they were not very good anyway, but all 10 of them betrayed our country.
Got it. So we got a few questions, and I know we're kind of stuck.
No, I'll stay if you can stay.
Oh, I'm on. Game on then. Let's bring it on then. So we've got another question from Miss Jackson. She said, what are your thoughts on officers who graduate from West Point as opposed to other commissioning sources, the percentage who make it to the top of the Army? Have you seen bias there?
Yeah, there is a natural bias. And it's maybe not on purpose, but it's a natural bias. And I come from a family, like my father was an officer, my brother was an officer, I was an officer. My father went through OCS, my brother went through ROTC, and was commissioned second lieutenant at the University of Texas in Austin, Longhorns. And then I went to West Point. See the difference with my brother. When he graduated and went into the Army, I think there may be 15 of them, maybe back in 2025 of them who were second lieutenants there from the University of Texas. When I graduated from West Point, there were 960 of us starting the Army. So that's already a core group that you have known, you've sacrificed with for 4 years. So there's already, maybe it's not by commission, maybe it's by omission, of people that you naturally know that you probably can trust. I agree that's a bias. But also with ROTC, what I've found, at least, those who got to know each other when they used to have the basic camp and they had advanced camp. And again, I'm not sure what it is now, but that was also a way to bond. I thought there was a bond with many of the graduates of HBCs, that there was a certain bond there. But the bond for West Point, if you look at the number or percentage of officers who graduate from West Point, at least when I was a second lieutenant, so I don't know the stats now, but when I graduated, out of all the second lieutenants, it was a much larger Army then, it was only 11, 12% of all lieutenants in my year group. So year group 81 starting out, only 11 to 12% of them were from West Point. Yeah. You roll the tape forward, though, to now general officers, and out of our year group, it's nearly 50% of the general officers in year group 81 were from West Point. So how does that happen? Are they just so much better? I would say no. It's great education, great motivated people are focused, who are probably going to stay in or have a propensity to stay in at least 20 years, but not for sure. Or is it the fact that you know your peers, which is something that I think more studies should be done on. Many people think it's the people who have the most influence over your career are your seniors. And then
oh, looks like he got another phone call. He'll be back. He'll be back.
Can you hear me?
Wait. There we go. You had another phone call, sir?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody saw, but I was on CNN today and Jake Tapper. So I got all sorts of people calling, let me know what they thought of it.
It's all good. It's all good.
So I can't see myself. So let me do the video. Okay. Can you see me?
I cannot see you, but I could hear you perfectly
okay,
well.
but you can at least hear me. Okay, so at least
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Finish the point is senior leaders have certainly impact. Senior and mid-level leaders have an impact. But the folks who have the absolute most impact on your career, and it's not well known by folks when you're a junior officer, are your peers. Whether it's for assignments and someone says, hey, do you know so-and-so? Oh yeah, he's a good guy. She's a good officer. He's a good officer, whatever. So there is that also West Pointers. And then there are West Pointers at every level who have this feeling of, well, if I got to pick between two of them, I'll probably pick someone West Point. So there is some level of bias there.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Obviously. I mean, and we appreciate the honesty about the bias that actually could be there. And thank you for the question, Ms. Jackson. So let's kind of veer towards some of questions that circle around minority officer and minority officer issues. So we've got one here from Mr. Eric Littlejohn. What's going on, Eric? How are you? He says, can we talk about your views of competition amongst minority leader officers? It seems that there is a tendency to compete. There's a tendency to compete against ourselves, maybe a seemingly more attainable target. We want to have the ability to have our performance / potential assessed equally with non-minorities, yet we attempt to outperform, not building each other.
That's a good question. Before I answer, though, the name Littlejohn, I must ask, Eric Littlejohn, are you related to Littlejohn, who was in the Army years ago? As one of my father's best friends' last name was Littlejohn. So there's a story with that also. Just be curious if that's the same Littlejohn, whose father might have been air defense or field artillery back in the 1950s and 1960s. So really, as far as competition, I always, and we're all different in this, but I always believe that I was not competing against people, I was competing against a standard. And if you compete against a standard, well, more than just one person can win. And that's how we fight on the battlefield, because you gotta depend on each other. The unit to your left, your right, your rear, your front. So I never felt like I was competing against individuals. And maybe that is a weird way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But even as a troop commander, I thought if I could meet the standard or surpass the standard, I would do just fine. But if someone else met or passed the standard, that's good too. So I never felt it was direct. So it never felt like I had to step on somebody else to get, my recognition or whatever. So I guess I don't know enough about that, where if there's a tendency to compete against ourselves. I never felt that way. In fact, there was never enough African-American officers in units where I was at. So if there was, we were on the same side. That's for dang sure. I don't know if that helps any. I'm going to plug in my phone, so I'm going to put the speaker back on, so I know there'll be echo for a while.
It's all good. I will go ahead and I guess let me shift over on the singular screen, and I will allow you to do your thing, sir. So I'll go ahead and mute for right now. But if you're just checking in, we're almost at 1 hour already with discussion with Major General retired Pittard. We're going through a slew of questions that feel free for you to send in your questions. He's obviously answering them and he's knocking them out the park, of course. I think with Major General Pittard, he is kind of giving us a real answer versus a very box cookie cutter sort of answer. And it's a truth that's absolutely refreshing. It's not something typically you will get from a lot of folks. So it's something that I'm sure people are appreciating. I am still here. So let's go ahead and I guess bring back on Major General Pittard, and we will have more questions that's coming in. Let's go ahead and put on a question from our Major Promotable Michael Hamilton. I had him as a guest a couple days ago. So how you doing, Major Hamilton? The question he asks, sir, is, sir, what is the most important thing that currently serving African American Army officers can do to improve the Army's equality? And are you still just as bad as pull-ups as you did when your old age showed up in Bessemer, Iraq in 2015? Just kidding.
Mike Hamilton, how are you? I got to brag on Mike Hamilton. He was in the 82nd Airborne, just an infantry, beast, king. Just when he took the Bataan Death March, I believe he was like #1 going through that 26-mile thing. I was so proud of him. When I talked about at least 50% of all my aide-de-camps were African American, he was one of them. But I do want to, we want to tell an accurate history. And when I was in Iraq, just inspecting some soldiers and stuff and units in 2015, he was with the 82nd Airborne. I think it was you, Brigade X, I'm not sure what he was. And he, after a briefing, he challenged me to a pull-up contest, which I just didn't understand because he and I would do push-ups and sit-ups fast. He didn't even know if I could do pull-ups. So I said, well, you go first. He did. You have to tell me, Mike, how many you did. I just know that when I got up, slowly took off my shirt. General officer now. I may have done them slowly, but I believe I did more than you, Mike. Is that correct? If you want to, my understanding that went around the entire Army. Of a young major challenging a major general in pull-ups and losing. But I'm digressing. The most important thing that you can do is make sure in your area of the world, whether you're a squad leader, whether you're now, Mike, I believe you're major, promotable, lieutenant colonel, in your area, make sure that there is equality, because we can improve it step by step in everybody's area, and call it out when it's not right. The Army has gotten so much better than and again, my view is a view of 70 years almost, because I'm talking about when my father was in, and then my brother, and then myself. So it has gotten better over the long term, so much better. But if you're in it right now, it's all you see. So you don't care about the history in the past. You want to know about you and equality right where you are. So improve the position where you are. That's what's important.
Excellent. And I think he did a little bit of a follow-up to your comments, sir. He said he did 16, but you did 21 and you did it poorly. So he still remembers that.
I asked before we did it. I said, all I had to do is get my head above the bar. Is that right? I mean, he did them fast. I was impressed. I thought, dang, I took my time, but I still did 21.
There you go. That's all that matters, as long as you get it over the bar. So let's go ahead and jump into some more. If I can say one more thing, though.
Go ahead. On that, for leaders like Mike Hamilton, who I see you all as the future of the Army, you've got to do this at every level. Again, you're a major now, major promotable, and a lieutenant colonel. But I started kind of doing that as a second lieutenant. So every level, where not only I experience racism at every level, but at every level I tried to either combat it or make sure that whoever I was in charge of in my little space of the world, was as equal as possible. Because just because someone's African American or a person of color doesn't mean that they're not racist. I receive a lot of racists. I mean, it's a Samuel L. Jackson character in Django. I mean, there are people like that in a analogous way that that have issues. So just make sure in your space of the world, you make sure it's all right.
Got it. And let's see, we got a question that's coming in. It said, "Sir, thank you for your time. How do we get senior leadership to be more reflective of ranks in order to combat redressing policy blunders? Example, female hair grooming standards for African Americans."
Oh, yeah. I guess it is just getting people to listen. I think we had an opportunity there with the Surgeon General of the Army, General West, and I know her as Nadja Grammer West. I mean, remember when she was a young cadet at West Point? She was class of A2 a year behind me. And I had hoped that maybe some of those rules with having more senior leadership of women of color would change. I'm not familiar, and maybe that's part of the problem. I'm not familiar with some of the rules were. I know one that just seemed silly to me was that you couldn't have hair color that wasn't supposedly natural for you, which I find insulting. If I want to have blonde, I got blonde hair. I'll have blonde hair. But I thought that was an issue. I know I spoke up about that back in whenever that was, 2012. I just said that's not a good idea. So again, I'm trying to see if it's that, but bring it up in sessions like this with current active duty leaders. Send it up, and I think if there's enough groundswell for that, that might change. So when Sergeant Major Grinston is on this program, mention that to him seriously.
Yeah, just a tidbit. I would say normalize these discussions. This should be it shouldn't be a whisper sort of situation. Unfortunately, I see a lot of real discussions that go on regarding race and regarding racial issues are often whispered in workspaces versus open, real, natural dialogue. And I think it's very revealing, obviously. And this is a question I've asked a few folks. The question was for me, who was it benefiting to live in a situation or work in a situation where you were afraid to talk about racial issues that you're going through? Who exactly is it benefiting in the long run? And that's a question I think if you want to answer it, sir, or if others want to chime in, they can as well.
Let's let people chime in.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to have them chime in. Chime in.
Also, another person I should have mentioned was Lieutenant General Gwen Bingham, who just recently retired. In fact, she was the highest-ranking African-American female officer outside of the Medical Corps and U.S. Army history. And I wish that had been addressed with her, because she would have taken that, to the top on that. So, yeah.
I would love to actually have her on this discussion if she's.
And you can. She's in Austin, Texas. Get in touch with me. I'll pass on her information to you.
Too easy. I appreciate it, sir. So we've got some more comments and more questions coming in. Okay. This one from Mr. Damon Davis. The question is, what do you think about General Abrams, the USFK commander, is doing with regard to combating racism on Penn?
On the peninsula? I don't know. I know Abe Abrams as a peer. He was a year behind me at West Point. And he also took over from me at Fort Irwin, NTC, or both 1-stars. So I've known him. In fact, I knew him as Bruce. And I think it was as a major at CGSC. I saw him in the pic, said, "Bruce!" And he didn't move. I said, "Bruce, it's Dana." He said, he turned around and said, "It's Abe." I said, "Oh, you're Abe now." But anyway, for General Abrams, again, I see him as a peer and have not worked under him ever. So I guess I don't know what he's doing as far as race on the peninsula. So please enlighten me. I know there's a lot of talk, but you got to walk the walk and not just talk it.
Yes.
And there's some that do talk and walk. I'll tell you, General Funk, the TRADOC commander who I've known for years, actually does the walk. I mean, he's a guy who also recommended, I believe, Sergeant Major Grinson to be and Sergeant Major Grinson, if you don't know, is a person of color. His father was African American. To be the Sergeant Major of the Army, as an example. He has had aide-de-camps, I think, that are African American. He has looked out for African American officers. So that's a good thing. It's interesting because he has followed General Abrams in, I think, 4 different assignments, 3 or 4 different assignments, including Brigade Command, G3 of 1st Cav, and at Fort Leavenworth. So for Abrams, just to be quite honest, I don't know his record in doing that. I know what I see, and it's mixed, to be honest with you. It's mixed. One thing he did do, though, and when he took over the NTC, and I'd been there for a year and a half, I'd been there 2007 to 2009, so almost 2 years. I made a lot of changes, made a lot of good things happen. But one thing he did that I didn't do is he asked, why isn't there a rocks chapter there? When I heard about that later, I thought, dang, I helped start rocks chapters everywhere I went, except at the NTC. But that's one thing Abe Abrams did. So my hat's off to him for asking that question and then making it happen. And so there's got to be some goodness there. So I would hope that he's walking the talk. But I hear a lot of talk. I hope it's actually happening.
Excellent point about the rocks. I would say, I had a great experience with the rocks when I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. This is 2014 when I left Fort Campbell, but great opportunity, great place that you could actually receive the mentorship and express point of views of things that you're going through personally. So, great organization as well. We've got some more questions, sir. And thank you for your question, Mr. Davis. The next question that we see is, if you could change anything in your Army career, would you? If so, what would it be? And this is coming from Ms. Jackson again.
I almost feel like there's a reason for everything, but someone asked once, do you feel like you made some mistakes? It's like, oh, heck yeah. Yeah, you got time? We'll talk about that. I guess it all turned out just fine. What would I have changed? I maybe even as a senior leader, I was welcoming to all sorts of folks. And as a senior leader, that ended up being kind of used against me, unfortunately. There was a 3-year investigation on a contracting thing at Fort Bliss. Even after 3 years, it was found that it was unsubstantiated. And then at the very end of the report, they put, there was a perception of favoritism. I was like, what the heck is that? If I had to change something, I would have ensured that all understood that that I wanted nothing to do with the contract. I had nothing to do with the contract. I just pushed contracting to get somebody. I didn't care who it was. So I think if I had to change something, it might be that because that's, you Google my name, you still see that's like, what? It might be something like that. That's as a senior leader. But as a junior leader, I don't know what what I would have changed. Again, we all do things for different reasons. Many times commanders will ask you to report early. I think once I had children, I didn't do that. I remember as a major going to Fort Hood This was whatever 1994, coming out of Sam's, and I was just asked. Well, I was called by one of the other majors. Hey, they need you to report early. I said, no, I'm going to get my family settled. That's just how we do it. I knew by saying that, though, when I showed up, I had better be pretty dang good. And so I did. But I don't think I would have changed any of that. But I know going in, I dug myself a hole in perception that that maybe he's not committed enough because he didn't report in early. I reported on time, but I didn't report early because every organization will absolutely use you if they can, and then you got to clean up things with your family. And I always felt like new PCS, I will settle my family, and I violated that one time, and I think I would change that. And that's going into Fort Riley as now a colonel promotable. I was taking over DCG. I allowed myself, the CG called me personally and said, hey, I'd like you to report early. And I did. What I should have said was, nope, I'm going to go by. I'm going to see my my grandmother. She's old and sick. And I didn't do that. I reported early, went straight from Germany to Kansas. I didn't stop by. And then my grandmother passed away in February. And I will always regret that. So, so most of the things that I'm talking about as far as changing has to do with your family.
Got it.
If you are, quote, successful, unquote, you have your family at the end of your career, of your time in the military. You want to be standing by that same man or woman you started with. So if I change anything, it would have been that. I know it's a long answer, but that's probably things I would have changed.
We got another question. We got two more questions here. The next question, sir, is what guidance would you give the current generation to continue the momentum that is undergoing and not allow it to die down like it does for most after most sensing sessions? So, yeah, good question, by the way, Dewan.
It is a national movement. We are tired of this. We as a country ought to be, but we as a people, I'm talking about people of color, specifically African Americans, we cannot let this moment end. So the question is, how do you keep this going? You just have to. Wherever you see elements of even sniff out this legacy of systemic racism, call it out. We have to. So you keep the momentum going. And
I agree fully.
And it can't just be the military. I know this is a military audience, but it's incumbent upon people like myself and others who are now in the corporate world to do something about it. When this came out, I asked our general counsel, who was also a VP like me, hey, are we writing a letter? No, that we don't know if that's good for the corporation. Okay, talk to HR VP, then talk to the CEO. So when you do something like that, though, you get kind of called out. So I ended up having being part of writing the letter. I didn't care. By me writing a letter, we put in, the killing of the murder of George Floyd, which probably would never have been in the letter. So we as a corporation put out a letter about, legacy of racism, and we're not going to stand for it. But it wouldn't have happened if I didn't say something. So all of you are potential fire starters where you are. And we got to start these fires all over the place, and we'll turn this into a flame. And that is ending systemic racism in our country, wherever you see it.
Got it. Sir, I would just add on to it. I understand that folks, do want to write letters, and people may, be satisfied with that. I say don't be satisfied with just receiving a letter. Don't just be satisfied with the words of "we are thinking of the murder of George Floyd." I would say, hey, follow up with them. Hey, can you show us your corporate leadership and the representation that's there for people of color who traditionally, as you have stated throughout our discussion, are left out from that leadership role. So
that's right. if I could add on to that, that also was a discussion, which I should have mentioned, which is, this is just the start. We're going to start with the fact we have 52 executives and only one of them is African American, and that the bench, we're not creating a bench. So every company ought to be thinking that way. But most CEOs aren't quite like that. I wish everybody was like Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. He got upset when he found out that Apple demographics had 55% white. He said, "Oh, that's way too many." I mean, like I said, my company's was 89%. That it ought to look more like America.
Got you. All right, so we've got 3 more questions right here. Let's pull it up real fast. The question is, no, that's a comment. The question is, what advice would you give young Black males to continue in combat arms and not transfer into branches that may translate into a job after the Army?
I guess my advice, period, and this would be employment in general, is do what you enjoy doing. If you want to one day possibly be, a leader in the Army, a combat arms, but if you don't enjoy leading troops in combat, like in infantry, armor, field artillery, aviation, air defense, special forces, then don't do it. I mean, because what's worse is that you would be a part of it and for the wrong reasons, and you're not motivated. But that's why we got to catch people as cadets and motivate them that, hey, this is the arm of decision. We need leaders everywhere, and it's not to take away from transportation, quartermaster, others, finance, but we need leaders everywhere, especially leaders of color. So we have to be better influencers. And in ROTC, West Point, OCS, as people are putting in their choices. And not everybody gets their choice, by the way. It's the needs of the Army. I got that. But at least trying to influence them, tell them it's a positive experience, because it is.
And you said a key word there, I believe, in my opinion, sir. Not everyone gets a chance to make that choice. I would say the gatekeepers of those branch decisions should be more mindful of diversifying the different branches, of purposely putting individuals of color in certain branches that will eventually give them the opportunity to have those leadership roles. But what do you think?
No, I think that's good. But I mentioned at least a recent experience in the Army in detailing branches, and specifically moving African Americans purposely to combat arms who may not have wanted to, didn't work out well at all. That's why I just tend to think that you'll do better in something that you like doing, and you will, in fact, ideally excel in that. That's why, I always liked, well, at least from the first time I got introduced to tanks, I liked tanks. So that's why I stayed with it. But everybody doesn't get that opportunity even to be introduced to that enough. So, and you need to see maybe people that look like you. There was when I went through, it's called TCAT for West Point. That's the armor training. It was back then was Fort Knox, Kentucky. It just so happened that the company commander in the Army who had the tanks was this really dashing looking African American cat. It could have been like Denzel Washington he had this mustache. He was giving orders. I thought, I want to be him. And so just something as small as that was an influencer to me. I think it was Captain Gordon. It was bad, as in good bad, and impressive. So other people ought to be introduced to that. So that's where the Michael Hamiltons, who are focused on doing good things in their careers and everything else, will have to take time to go out and talk to people. And that's tough because, you're fighting alligators in your own, in your own unit and career, but every now and then is to be a part of this overall kind of recruiting effort.
Yeah. Well, I've got, I had my Major Hamilton as a guest before, and I think we're going to try to connect again, and he's going to share with a lot of soldiers and civilians who may be checking out our discussion, his story as well. And I want to also name drop another one who I recently had. And if you get a chance to check out that discussion, it was great. It was with Major Cook, Chevy Cook. He was impressive as well. So I just want to give a shout out to those two officers that I got a chance to talk with. But sir, over our almost 90 minutes now, and we're coming to a close. I just want to say, just thank you for the candidness of your answers and the candidness of our discussion. This is something that obviously, if you want to come back on again and talk with me, maybe go into more details about other topics regarding race and in the military, you're very welcome to come and chat with me again.
Well, thank you. And I thank the audience, who I think primarily a military audience.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your service. And I don't think we do enough of that, of really, really appreciating the sacrifice, the fact that you're on point for our nation. You can be called at any time, and the effect it has on your families and overall. So thank you and your families for your service.
Ooh,
Thank
it
you.
looks like we got one more question, sir. One more good question. And this is the last question of the night, y'all. And the question comes from
Tony
Mr.
Udell.
Anthony Udell. He said, Major General Pittard, I remember you as a young cadet, but I would love to hear your opinion on confining education while in the military. I think he meant to say continuing. Yeah, continuing education while in the military. How do you recommend officers prepare for the eventual transition to life after the military?
Oh yeah, I always believe of trying to be as educated as you can be. That's why I went to the second year of Leavenworth, because I saw Tony Udell there, and he was 2 years ahead of me at West Point, and was certainly one of those influential leaders and senior upperclassmen that you just respected. But that's one reason why after Command and General Staff College, I went to School of Advanced Military Studies, because I just wanted to be, as good as I could be educated in there. And some people also went for their masters. If, I guess it goes back to that question, what would you change? I would have changed maybe that. I think in CGSC, I would have done like Central Michigan University. Because now with Sam's got a master's from Sam's, but corporate people say kind of like, what? Where's that? Leavenworth? But Central Michigan, different story. Or getting your master's from a civilian school. So I guess I would change that. But as you progress also, I went to, for the War College, took a fellowship, went to Harvard. That was enlightening. So continuing to become educated and get educated. Even when I left the military, I just wasn't sure of how transferable my skills were. So I took a 3-week executive course at Dartmouth College with 30 other executives from 9 different countries around the world. And out of all that, I learned that, wait a minute, Army kind of prepared me pretty well. But there were things specifically in the corporate world that I didn't know. So again, it was going to school again. And Tony Udell will remember this. I've always felt like we are lifetime learners, always. Just soak it up. You never stop learning. So yes, continuing education, whether it's formal education, but it's learning. And for the next level, if I can add one more thing too, is also sometimes think 2 levels up and at least 1 level down. And that you're a captain. Well, start thinking, what is your battalion commander thinking? So, I mean, that's where you aspire to be. Get in his head on what he's thinking. I always thought that, and especially in combat, in Desert Storm, I really thought my battalion commander was probably going to get killed. I don't know why. And I thought I was going to have to take over the battalion. So I thought bigger than just my company. So and you look at that also in the corporate world. You think, okay, if I'm the president or CEO, what would I do? And by doing that, there's also more of an empathy. And then it's also understanding the leader's intent overall, which will help you do your job better. I know it's a long answer, Tony Udell, but thank you.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Udell. And sir, I want to just say in closing, we really appreciate you coming and chatting with me on here. You're welcome to come back again and just you're oozing mentorship, and people are, taking in the words that you're saying. People are, of course, giving us really excellent questions, and I'm looking forward to another opportunity to work with you.
Excellent. And the last words would be, no matter what you're doing, be as competent as you can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that, sir. And sir, again, you take care of yourself. And if you can, just hang out in the broadcast room so I could just talk to you really fast,
Okay.
and we'll call it a day.
All right. Thank you, Otis.
All right. Mhm. So, in parting, we had a great discussion with Major General Retired Pittard. If you want to reach out to him, of course, he's on Facebook. He's an author, of course. He has written a book regarding the Caliphate in Iraq. And, check out his book that he has as well. And I will say in parting, normalizing discussions between races about racial issues that goes on amongst minorities is something that the Army is encouraging, and it's something that's been encouraged of overall by a lot of the armed services. So I encourage you to have these discussions, have genuine discussions, and then think of ways and policies that you can enact right now to actually fix the issue. Yeah, we had a discussion on the issue, but now let's fix the issue. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be tough, but it's going to be worth it, I believe, in the long run. So, as I say in parting, as always, take care of yourself, take care of your family, and take care of others. Bye now.